Okay, hello everybody. I'd like to thank you for signing in to this event hosted by the LSU Press. I'm going to be talking about my new book just released in June it's called Reinventing the American Thoroughbred, the Arabian Adventures of Alexander Keene Richards. Now we'll pause for a few minutes to let everybody else kind of catch up, those who may not have signed in yet, and then I'll go ahead and begin talking about my book for you. Well, hello again. My name is Gary Odell, and I'm going to be talking to you about my new book published by the LSU Press. This is what it looks like. Um, the designers at LSU did a marvelous job on putting together this cover. I think it really stands out. And I'll talk more about what this picture on the front cover stands for in just a minute. First, though, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm retired from Morehead State University in Kentucky. Just a couple of years ago, I taught there for about 23 years, I believe it is. I'm a professor of geography with a very strong interest in regional history. In fact, a number of my colleagues have told me that even though professionally I'm a geographer, that I'm actually a closet historian because so much of what I do research on and write about is actually deals with history. Now, I want to let you know about my website. It's called Tales from Old Kentucky. Let's see, yeah, that's the right side up. And you can reach this at Gary Odell, gary-odell.com. That's GARY-ODELL.com. And on this website, I freely share almost 60 different articles and essays that I have published over the years, which are in PDF format, and you're free to read them online or download them. There's no charge for that at all. Now, this book has been a long process of putting it together. Almost 15 years that I spent on it. And actually, it's a spinoff from some other work that I was doing. I had a book published 2 years ago by the Kentucky Press called Bluegrass Paradise, Royal Spring and the Birth of Georgetown, Kentucky. And this is a community that was founded in 1775 as a pioneer stockade at a time when Indian hostilities were quite a threat. And the settlers who came into Kentucky were looking for mainly settlements, to make settlements around a spring, a good spring that would be a water supply. Pretty much every town and city in central Kentucky was founded at a large spring. Now you might wonder, what does this have to do with the horse book? Well, as it turned out, Royal Spring, or Georgetown, Kentucky, was founded at the largest spring in central Kentucky. And as I was doing research about this settlement and the spring, I learned that a man named Alexander Keene Richards owned one half of this spring. And the more I learned about him, the more fascinated I became with this man. He was one of the leading thoroughbred breeders during the 19th century nationwide. And he was a pretty amazing person. He made, he had an idea that he could improve the endurance, the stamina of the American thoroughbred horse by breeding purebred Arabians to thoroughbreds. And he was of the opinion that no purebred Arabians had ever been obtained from the Near East. Now, at this time, racing was a great deal different than it is today. It was more a contest of endurance than it was a race of speed. The type of racing that took place before the Civil War was what is known as heat racing. Now, a heat consisted of multiple turns around a mile course. So one heat might consist of 3 or 4 miles that a horse would run at a full gallop. Then the horses would get a short break, maybe 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, and then they do it again. And then they do it again. And then they do it again. During the course of a day, a horse might be expected to run at full gallop for 20 or 25 miles. Now, this was pretty hard on the animals. Some horses were lamed permanently. Some even dropped dead on the track. So Richards believed that he could endow the thoroughbred horse with more endurance, the ability to compete more successfully in these long distance, grueling contests by turning to the Arabian horse. Arabian horses were legendary for their stamina, capable of running across the desert landscape for days, literally, with very food or water. And in order to carry out this plan of his, he made 2 different trips into the Near East, one from 1851 through 1853, and another one in 1855 through 1857. And he went into the deserts of Syria with some companions and bargained directly with the nomadic Bedouin tribes in order to purchase the most superior Arabian horses that could be had. He was the first Westerner ever to do this, of any nation, the first person to go in and obtain superior Arabian horses from these Bedouin tribes. So that in itself was quite an accomplishment. Now, he started out as a young man with a great interest in horses. He was obsessed basically with horses to such an extent that after he graduated from college, and his grandfather, who was his ward, sent him on a grand tour of Europe, that he turned this tour into an expedition to visit all of the major equine centers of the old world. Now, the grand tour was a long-standing tradition in Europe and was being adopted by wealthy Americans at this time. And normally, a grand tour, people would go, young people would be sent, and they would visit the cathedrals and the museums and other, the Roman ruins and other attractions of the old world. But this was not what Keene Richards wanted to do. Instead, he was so obsessed with horses and learning about horses and how they were bred in different places that he persuaded his companions to follow him on an expedition to visit all of the major equine centers all through Europe and to extend those travels into Africa and into the Near Eastern regions. He traveled tens of thousands of miles on his first trip, visiting 3 different continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and stopped at pretty much every important equine center that was known. Now, he was being sponsored by his grandfather, of course, in this, and his grandfather was a very wealthy man. He owned a large plantation in northeastern Louisiana in Carroll Parish, it's East Carroll today, that produced thousands of bales of cotton every year, and that was a considerable source of wealth. In fact, his grandfather, William Keene, was considered to be one of the wealthiest men in Kentucky, which is where Richard's hometown was, where he was born and raised. So William Keene, Dr. Keene, owned a property in Georgetown, Kentucky, where the Royal Spring was located, and he owned this plantation in Louisiana called Transylvania Plantation, as well as several other large plantations totaling probably 4,000 or 5,000 acres altogether. So he was sent abroad, sponsored by his grandfather, who had obviously deep pockets. He went first to England. He had 2 companions traveling with him. One was Oliver Kellam, who was the heir to Pecan Grove Plantation in Louisiana, also in Carroll Parish, and a man named Pickett. Pickett being an instructor at the college. It was Bethany College in West Virginia. And Pickett would serve as sort of he was an older man, and he would serve as sort of a guide and a chaperone for these young men as they traveled through these foreign lands. So they came first to England. They visited the races in Yorkshire and other English race courses, then crossed the Channel into Normandy, where there was another the French breeding centers for thoroughbreds there. Traveled through France to the border with France and Spain, and spent some time exploring the Pyrenees Mountains. Now, at that time, he could apparently conceive the idea of extending his travels further and obtaining 1 or more Arabian horses, because he wrote back to his uncle in Louisiana that he would like to buy an Arabian horse in Cairo and ride it to up to Constantinople and ship it home, first to Liverpool and then to Louisiana. So that was the first mention he made of this idea of his of importing Arabian horses. Well, the travels of these young men were nothing short of remarkable. They crossed into Spain, and here he had a chance to view Arabian horses that had been recently imported by Queen Isabella. And that just cemented his desire after seeing these magnificent specimens. He crossed into Africa, across the Strait of Gibraltar, bought some horses, barb horses, in Morocco, rode these across northern Africa for 1,000 miles. Then they took a sailing ship, to the island of Malta in the Mediterranean. From Malta, they took a steamer to Alexandria, Egypt, and into Cairo, and I believe they probably visited the pyramids while they were there. And from Cairo, Richards helped to pioneer a new route across the Sinai Peninsula to visit the ruins of Petra. Some of you may be familiar with these ruins, having seen them in the ending of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Those were the ruins of Petra. And they had just been discovered recently by Westerners a few years before Keene Richards made his trip. And they crossed the Sinai to these ruins in a camel caravan. And Richards entertained himself by racing camels. Well, from Petra, they headed north. They were now in the Ottoman Empire. This was once a large empire of an Islamic empire, but was sort of in its latter days. Its power and influence had waned considerably by this time. So they crossed into the Ottoman Empire, headed to Jerusalem, and spent a considerable amount of time visiting all of the sacred sites associated with Christianity. Now, in Jerusalem, he bought his first Arabian horse, a horse known as Makladi. This was a stallion, a very attractive stallion that just captured his attention and that he had to have. From Jerusalem, they traveled to Beirut. Now, this was where their expedition really began into the desert. In Beirut, he hired a guide, a man named Yusuf Badra. He was a Syrian Christian, and he was a dragoman. That was an official title, an official representative of the Ottoman Empire, who essentially served as a facilitator for tourists into the region. Yusuf could speak several different languages, including English, and he would be the person responsible for obtaining all the supplies that they needed to venture into the desert and to arrange for transport and extra guards and so on, everything that was necessary for an expedition. And he was quite a character. Just a few months previously, Yusuf Badra had served as a guide for another Kentuckian, a man named John Ross Brown. Brown was a writer, and he was gathering material for a book about the region. He was a pretty influential writer. In fact, Mark Twain was influenced by his writings. So Brown wrote a book about his experiences in the East, and he was so impressed with his guide, Badra, that he titled the book Yusuf. I want to read just a couple of selections from my book that describe Yusuf, because Yusuf, he is quite a flamboyant character, almost too much to be believed. All right, this is from Brown's book and describes his encounter with Badra, who was recommended to him for the purpose. And Badra pulled a book of recommendations out of his sash and said, "Gentlemen, this is my book of recommendations. I have taken 1,000 American gentlemen through Syria. Yes, sir, the Americans like me. I like the Americans. I hate Englishmen. I won't take an Englishman. They don't suit me. Can't get along together. I know too much for them. But the Americans suit me just fine. Always ready, up to everything. Fun, fight, or frolic." Now, Badra was a very colorfully dressed person. He wore a fez, one of those sort of flat-topped hats. He wore bright yellow boots. The fez was red. He wore a blue jacket, pantaloons, and his sash was stuffed full of knives and sabers and scimitars. He also had an Arabian horse of his own, one that he called Syed Solomon. Now, Keene Richards considered him to be the most knowledgeable person about horses that he met in all of his time abroad. And I want to read one more extract from my book. And actually, this is from Ross Brown's book, but he describes how Badra greeted his horse, Syed Solomon, every morning when he got up. So, every morning regularly before mounting, Yusuf greeted Syed Solomon in the most brotherly manner. He asked him how he felt, how he had slept, what was the general state of his health, had anybody stolen his oats, and upon being answered, as Syed Solomon was in the habit of answering, by a peculiar working of the ears, a neighing and nickering and other well understood signs, Yusuf could never restrain his affection, but invariably hugged him around the neck, exchanged kisses with him, and shook hands with his forefoot to show him that they were still devoted friends and could never be separated by any adversity of fortune. Now, the Syed Solomon so captured Keene Richards' attention that he offered to buy him from Yusuf Badra, and Badra was more than willing to sell. So he now had two stallions. He had the stallion Masood, which is what he renamed Syed Solomon, and he had the stallion Makladi, which he had purchased in Jerusalem. and he purchased, I think, another mare while he was still in Beirut. Now Richards also wanted to go. He didn't have enough horses. He wanted to go deeper into the desert regions, to Damascus, and from Damascus to go into the desert, strike out into the desert to encounter the Bedouins and try to purchase some really fine horses from them. Now, Yusuf was not able to do this for him. He could do the facilitation, he could come up with the supplies, but he could not guide Richards into the desert. So Richards was required to hire a sheik from the Anaza Bedouins, and this particular tribe made a practice of serving as guides for Western tourists who wanted to go into the region. Now, his name was Medjul el Mezrab, and he was a minor sheik of the Anaza. And so he agreed to take the party. This would be Pickett and Oliver Kelham, Keene Richards, as well as Yusuf Badra, into the desert beyond Damascus. So, unfortunately, on this first trip, although the sheik took them out to Palmyra, which was the ruins of an ancient city, and had hoped to encounter some of the tribes in that area, Richards was not able to buy any more Arabian horses at this time. So at this point, he decided to go ahead and continue with his friends to visit some of the horse centers in Central and Eastern Europe. But he had to do something about the horses. They needed to get back to Kentucky or to Louisiana. And in order to do this, he hired Yusuf Badra to ship them all the way across the Mediterranean to England and to North America. Now, this was an extraordinary trust that he placed in this man. But again, as he said, he thought Badra was the most expert horseman he had encountered in the whole region. And Badra was eager to see America. So it took almost a year for those horses to be sent back to America, because Badra took them first to Cairo, and while in Cairo, he got into an altercation and was stabbed and had to recover from his wounds for several months. But he proved adept at navigating all of the hurdles and difficulties associated with shipping, a transatlantic shipping of these horses. And so they ended up going to Liverpool in England, and from England they were shipped to New Orleans and brought up to Transylvania Plantation up the Mississippi, and were stabled there at Transylvania Plantation for a few months while they recovered from their long sea voyage. Almost 12 months it took to get them there. Okay, meanwhile, as Badra was taking his charges across, these young men continued up through Europe. They visited major equine centers in Trieste, the Lipanzer horses, who are known for their high-stepping performances. They visited Berlin in Austria, and a number of other important equine centers that I'm not going to trouble with right now. But they finally came back to England after an absence of 2 years and over 10,000 miles of travel. At this point, Richards was ready to start his breeding experiment. This was in 1853. And while he was on his way from Kentucky down to Transylvania Plantation in Louisiana, he stopped at Mammoth Cave in western Kentucky, and Oliver Kelham was with him, and also his cousin, Morris Keene. And they ran into a man who was a reporter for the New York Herald. Just a second. Bear with me just one moment. I'm drawing a mental blank. Well, we'll never mind on that for a moment. Maybe it'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, he invited him the men hit it off pretty well there at Mammoth Cave. They were, went on several tours there at the cave and together. And so Richards invited this reporter to come down with him and visit him at Transylvania plantation. Now, while they were traveling through Alabama, in Florence, Alabama, they found that the famous horse Paytona was being exhibited. And so they had to see Paytona because Paytona had gained nationwide recognition in 1845 in one of the last north-south match races that took place. These were basically races in which the South would pit their finest horse against the finest horse of the North. And they took place at the Union Course in New York. Now, Paytona had been walked literally from Alabama all the way through the Southland, all the way up to New York for this contest. This was a time when the railroad lines were not nearly as extensive and reliable as they are now. So they had literally walked their horse. Well, Paytona was pitted against the northern champion, a horse called Fashion, also a mare. And Paytona managed to defeat Fashion in two heats, 2 out of the 3 heats that they ran. But it took a very hard toll on Paytona. She was lamed in the contest and was unable to race ever again. So she was retired back to Kirkman's plantation just outside of Florence to become a breeding horse. So when Richards and his companions came through Florence, they saw Paytona, and knowing of her reputation, Keene Richards knew that he just had to have this horse for his breeding program. She was a pure-blooded English thoroughbred, and that's exactly the sort of horse that he wanted to have as the backbone of his experiment. So he managed to purchase Paytona. I think he paid about a little over $2,000 for her, which was a pretty substantial sum of money. In terms of today's money, that would be about $60,000 or $75,000. Nowhere near, of course, the stellar prices paid for some thoroughbreds today, but in that time, it was an almost unprecedented sum to pay that much for a horse. They continued on to Transylvania plantation, spent a few weeks there, and then returned back to Georgetown. In the meanwhile, picking up Paytona and bringing her up to the Georgetown stables. Now, Grandfather Keene was very indulgent of his grandson. He was not only financing these trips abroad to purchase Arabian horses, but also, setting up the Georgetown farm, which is known as Bluegrass Park, as a major estate, a horse farm estate. Well, Richards read up quite a bit now that he was back and concluded that he needed to make a second trip back to the East in order to get more Arabian horses. He had a few. He had 2 stallions and a mare, and he now had Paytona, an English thoroughbred, and he wanted to get some more Arabian stallions and mares. So he planned another trip, but he was much more careful about this one. His first trip had simply been a college student on basically on a leisurely trip for his own amusement. This one was going to be a business trip. So he read very carefully. He collected an extensive library of books about the East and about the Arabian horses and so on, and set off again. This time he would be accompanied by Morris Keene, his cousin, who is his best friend, and also the most famous animal artist in North America, a man named was Edward Troy. Troy was specialized in painting horses and had rendered wonderful portraits of some of the most famous horses in America over the last 20 years or so. He was currently teaching at Mobile, Alabama, but at Spring Hill College, but he had visited Georgetown to paint some commissions for the horsemen of the region, and this is where Keene Richards met him. And so they arranged for Troy to accompany the party on their second expedition which would depart from New York in 1855. Now, Troy traveled separately, but the men rendezvoused in London, and then followed a route that was somewhat similar to the route followed before, except instead of riding across Africa and going through the desert at Egypt and so on. Once they got to Gibraltar, they simply took passage aboard a steamer across the Mediterranean to Beirut. They made a side trip to Constantinople, and Richards bought a horse there, a mare called Luli, a very beautiful Arabian horse. And this was despite his determination this time not to buy just whatever horses might be available at coastal dealers, but to buy only from the Bedouins. But he saw this one horse and thought she was so perfect that she needed to be added to his stable. Now, from Beirut, they traveled to Damascus, and Richards made a trip to visit a sheik he had heard had a wonderful Arabian stallion, and tried to purchase that stallion, but had no luck because the sheik would not part with the stallion for any amount of money. Now, Richards was pretty eager to get back and get his breeding program in Kentucky going. So he left the purchasing, the travel among the Bedouins, to his companions, Morris Keene and Edward Troy. Now, Troy, of course, was an excellent judge of horse flesh, and anatomy from his many years of painting some of the best horses in America. So he felt they were in good hands, or his goals were in good hands, and so Richards went back to the United States. Now, Troy and Keene first decided that they were going to make a pleasure trip and visit all of the holy sites before venturing into the desert. So they visited the Sea of Galilee, traveled extensively through the region. They visited the Dead Sea, and Edward Troy broke out his paints and brushes from time to time and captured some of the most sacred scenes of the Holy Land in large canvases. These would be some of the most important paintings that he made during his career. Well, once this was done, and this would be in the spring of 1856, they were now ready to launch into the eastward into the desert lands. Now, they did not have the assistance of Sheikh Mesrab at this time, but they hired a company of city Arabs, I suppose, who would serve as guards and to set up the tents and to tend the horses and mules and so on. And they set off into the deserts a considerable distance south of Damascus to visit the Bedouin tribes. And so they went through the desert. They, as one biographer stated about their trip, they lived with the Bedouins, they ate with the Bedouins, they worshiped with the Bedouins. Essentially, they took the part of Bedouins for their expedition among these tribes. And they found that the Bedouin tribes were willing to sell some of their best horses for, a substantial quantity of gold. And the bargaining process would sometimes take quite a bit of time. It might take literally days to conclude the negotiations. They would offer a price, the Bedouin would want something else. In some cases, the negotiations fell through. In one case, the Bedouin tribesmen told them that if you were to load this horse with gold, can you do that? And Morris Keene said, no, we don't have enough gold to be able to do that. And so the Bedouin told them, well, if you could load this horse with gold, the gold would still be yours and the horse would be mine, because he would not sell. But they managed to purchase several good horses, came back to Damascus, also bought a camel, some Syrian oxen, and essentially, when these were brought back or shipped back to Georgetown, Bluegrass Park was turned into sort of an imitation. Well, people who visited thought they were actually traveling into the East because he had so outfitted the place with camels and Arabian horses and all the other trappings of the East that people could imagine that they had been transported across the ocean. Now, unfortunately, Badger was not there to see this. He had brought Badger back with him on his second trip. But unfortunately, Yusuf took sick the moment they arrived in Beirut, and he reunited with his family. They threw him a large dinner, but something evidently disagreed with him because he died the next morning of colic. And so Richards had him buried there in the cemetery and erected an elaborate stone in his memory. Now, once back in Kentucky, he got his breeding program started. He began to breed the Arabian stallions to American mares, including Paytona, and began to breed some of his mares to American horses. But he still was not content with the stock that he had. So in 1858, he made another trip. Now, this one was not to Arabia. This one was to England. And he was going to purchase the very best English thoroughbred stock that was available in the island nation and bring them back to become part of his breeding experiment. So here we have Richards on his return in late 1858 or early 1859. He had a number of foals that were the produce of his the earlier efforts in his breeding experiment. None of them were yet old enough to race, or most of them were not. There were a few, but it turned out that his experiment was not working out as well as he might have hoped. On the other hand, one has to give credit to the idea that you're not going to get the results that you want with just a generation or two of breeding. This is actually would have to be a long-term project that might take several decades to bear fruit. Unfortunately, he never got to continue with his experiment because the Civil War interrupted. He, having his wealth based on Southern cotton, he threw in on the Southern side. He sold his bluegrass farm, Bluegrass Park, to Edward Troy. This was sort of a subterfuge to avoid confiscation by Union authorities, since Kentucky finally came out on the Union side. Since Troy was a Swiss native, not an American citizen, and had no connection with the Southland, they figured that this would protect the farm against confiscation by the Yankees. Now, he sent Morris Keene with his horses to take them to Transylvania plantation in Louisiana, where he thought they would be safe there because that was sort of the heartland of the South. And for himself, he helped John C. Breckinridge, former Vice President of the United States and a senator from Kentucky, who was in imminent danger of being arrested by the Union authorities. He helped him flee from Kentucky and afterward became a volunteer aide-de-camp to General Breckinridge. Breckinridge was given a command by General Albert Sidney Johnson. So Breckinridge was in command of the Kentucky troops. Richards was his aide-de-camp. And Richards did not see a great deal of action. He was present at the siege of Vicksburg in 1862 and also at the battle for Baton Rouge, in which he was commended by the general in his after-action report for having urged on the troops in the heaviest action. But when the Breckinridge's troops withdrew from Baton Rouge and were then encamped in Alabama for a while under the command of General Van Dorn, Breckinridge sent for Richards because he had a special mission for him. Now, at this time, Kirby Smith and General Bragg were planning an invasion of Kentucky in the summer of 1862. And they wanted to have Breckinridge with him because he figured that he would be of extreme political importance in helping to raise more volunteers once they were in Kentucky, since Breckinridge was from Kentucky. Now, they asked Breckinridge to join them, and planning to come and join with Smith and Bragg, Breckinridge sent Keene Richards ahead to Lexington in Kentucky on this special mission. His mission was to contact the general's wife, Mrs. Breckinridge, and bring her down south to Cumberland Gap to meet him when the general came through the gap to join with the other Confederates then in Kentucky. Well, the Confederate invasion did not work out quite as well as might have been imagined. The Kirby Smith spread his troops a little too thin. The General Bragg was followed by Union General Buell up into Bardstown region of Kentucky. Bragg headed east, and Buell went on with his troops to Louisville. And Kirby Smith and Bragg thought that Buell would be content to sit in Louisville and cool his heels for a while, but that was not the case. He gathered additional troops in Louisville and immediately launched out to in a three-pronged attack against the Confederates. And they met, well, this is embarrassing and trying to remember everything that I want to remember, but, well, they met in battle, and the Confederates put up a good defense, and it was not quite clear who had actually won. But the Confederates were forced to retreat through Cumberland Gap. And so Keene Richards, although he had come in, Breckinridge was not able to rendezvous. His troops were on the way into Cumberland Gap when they learned of the defeat. Perryville, that's what I was trying to think of, the Battle of Perryville. Richards had made contact with Breckinridge's wife, and so she was on her way down to meet with Breckinridge. Unfortunately, everybody was marching the other direction instead of into Kentucky now. Richards came to Knoxville after this debacle and took ill. He was pretty seriously ill. And so Breckinridge was sent off to fight another battle, Stone's River, I believe it was. And Keene Richards wrote him with an idea that he could go to England and use his influence to purchase artillery for Breckinridge. And so Breckinridge gave his blessing. And so Keene Richards set off with his cousin Morris Keene for the Southland. He went down to Transylvania. And at Transylvania, he was now worried that since the Union Navy was contesting and control of the Mississippi River, that his thoroughbreds and other horses would no longer be safe there at Transylvania Plantation, being located on the bank of the Mississippi. So these were sent to the interior of Louisiana, to Rapides Parish, to the plantation of General Thomas Jefferson Wells, Dentley Plantation. Now, having done this, he went to Rapides Parish and visited with the general for a while, and his eye fell upon a horse that the general had just bred and was training, a horse that was named after, let's see, well, I forget his original name, but Keene Richards paid $5,000 for him, about $150,000 in today's money, and renamed him War Dance. Now, this horse had very famous parents. His dam was the famous Rio, who was a very successful breeder of racehorses. And the sire was the famous Lexington, who was also a leading sire. So this was impeccable parentage. So he paid $5,000 for War Dance, left him there at Dentley, continued on into Texas, and down to Matamoros, took ship for Havana and to England. And in England, it's not clear whether he actually was able to purchase any artillery from Breckinridge, but he may not have been willing to admit it if he did, because he was still there when the Civil War came to an end, and was advised by the American consul in England that he needed to get back to America and apply for an amnesty. So he came back and found that he was going to be in very difficult circumstances. His plantation having been liberated, he was able to, he tried to start production of cotton again, but he no longer had slave labor. He had to pay wages. And he ended up borrowing so heavily that in the years ahead, he was forced to file for bankruptcy, not once, but twice. He lost almost all of his property, including not only Transylvania plantation, but the farm in Georgetown. But fortunately, his creditors were personal friends, and so although they actually owned the property, he was allowed to live there and to continue his life as a thoroughbred breeder. Now, he had brought back his horses. The horses that were at Dentley Plantation, including some of his Arabians and thoroughbreds, had been sent on to Texas in 1863 when General Banks led an invasion into East Parish. A rather short-lived invasion, but General Wells at Dentley Plantation thought that it would be better to send all of his horses into Texas. So they ended up at a farm in Austin for the duration of the war. But as soon as the war was over, Richards came back, sent for his horses, and started breeding again. But by this time, most of his Arabians had passed on, and so he had only a couple left to continue his experiment. Now, the rest of his life, he was beset by financial difficulties and one loss after another of all of his old friends. His Arabian experiment had proved to be a complete failure. None of the horses that he bred between thoroughbreds and Arabians proved to be of particular note on the race course. And in fact, the whole rationale behind his experiment became obsolete, because after the war, heat races fell out of favor. Instead of heat races, multiple turns in which endurance was a necessity, it all became dash races, short races, one turn around a mile course, to where speed was more important than endurance. So the whole justification for that program was now gone. Now, he retained the respect of his fellow breeders, and he bred and sold a lot of horses, most of them being the progeny of War Dance, who he also had reclaimed after the war. But he was no longer the wealthy Kentuckian, the wealthy Kentucky gentry that he had once been. He could not import any more horses and had to make do with the stock that he had on hand. But even that proved to be pretty special. War Dance was a very good sire, one of the leading sires in America. Now, he finally passed away in 1881 of pneumonia. Shortly after, his friend Edward Troy also passed away, and the loss of his friend John C. Breckinridge, and the suicide of his friend and cousin Morris Keene. So the latter part of his life was a very unhappy period. And the last few years of his life, he raced less and less. Before the war, he had been accustomed to taking the Southern Circuit and pitting his horses on as many as a dozen tracks around the country in a season. But from about 1875 or 78 onwards, he would only race at one or two tracks per year, and mostly those close at home, those in Louisville or Nashville or Lexington. So he passed away, and he and all his family is buried in the Georgetown cemetery. Now that is essentially the gist of it. Before I take questions, I first want to make you all aware again of my website. That's the card, gary-odell.com. You'll find a lot of interesting articles there, and a number of them about dealing with equine history, a lot of them dealing with Kentucky history and landscape, and the other passion of mine, which is the study and exploration of caves. All right, I think it's now probably time for us to take a few questions from anyone.
Thank you, Gary. That was certainly fascinating look at the book. We've got a few questions here coming in from the audience. Tiffany asked about how much were each of these horses on average to purchase and ship. You touched a little bit about that, but why don't you talk a little bit more about the cost of these horses relative to money today?
Oh, well, it was pretty expensive. I do not have the exact figures in front of me without having to dig through the book, because remembering numbers is not one of my strengths. But I would have to say that it probably cost him on order of at least $1,000 per horse to ship these back to the United States, and that would be in like 1850s money. So kind of a good multiplier to use for to translate funding of that time to today's funding is just basically to multiply anything by the number 30. So if it was like, $500 or $1,000 for a horse, it's going to be like, 15 to 20,000 or more to ship a horse. If you're talking about all the way from a place like Beirut to England and then to America. That might be a little high. I'm thinking now that I think about it, it was probably more like $200 or $300. So you multiply that out, and it's going to be like $1,000 or $1,500 a horse in today's money. Again, like I said, I don't have the numbers at hand, so I'm not sure that's a very satisfactory answer. But anybody who has a question can always contact me through the email given on my website, and I'll be more than happy to explain in greater and more accurate detail.
Yeah, not an inexpensive enterprise, nonetheless. We have another question here from Susan about the rules of what defined a thoroughbred and when those changed.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's interesting. The defining a thoroughbred is kind of been a tricky thing all through its history. The original thoroughbred horse was created in the 17th and 18th centuries in England by crossing so-called Oriental horses with the native stock of England. And an Oriental horse was basically any horse from the Near East. They didn't actually distinguish very often between the main three types, which were Barb horses, Turkoman horses, and Arabians. And as it turns out, one of the underpinnings of Keene Richards' experiment was actually a myth, because modern DNA studies have shown that there's actually very little actual Arabian blood in the modern thoroughbred. So his quest to breed Arabian horses to thoroughbreds in order to increase their endurance was an attempt to replace something that was never there to begin with. The blood of the Oriental horses that were bred in England were the Barb and Turkoman, and the what are called the three great progenitors of the thoroughbred, the English thoroughbred, which is the Byerly, Turk, and this is stuff that I should know, but anyway, there were three horses, and each one of these has proved to be pretty much a Turkish horse, a Turkoman horse, rather than an Arabian horse, even though some of them were actually called Arabian in their name. Now, what it appears that the English were trying to do was to breed an almost pure Oriental type horse with only a smattering of common English stock in it. The trouble is that the stud books can't be believed. They are so full of misrepresentations. Breeders, for example, would make up lineages for horses in order to make them appear to be more thoroughly Oriental than they actually are. And this kind of misrepresentation and deception has sort of muddied the general stud book and the American stud book ever since. It's taking literally generations to try to clean up the mess that was made, and has not been done satisfactorily even to the present day, although a number of people have been working rather assiduously to try to clear up some of this misrepresentation. My friend Kathleen Curson, for one. Now, I hope that answers it sufficiently.
Yeah, that was great, Gary. Barbara asked, I mean, there were a lot of amazing things that you covered here, but what was the most shocking thing that you came across in your research?
Oh, actually shocking.
Or surprising?
They're surprising. Well, I think that probably the most surprising thing was the determination of this young Keene Richards. He was only 23 years old when he set out on this first trip of his. And for him and his two friends to travel through this area, I mean, literally tens of thousands of miles by every mode of transportation you can imagine, sailing ship, steamship, horseback, camelback, by foot, by train, to cover all of this and going through areas that were wild and unsettled, in which there was a real danger that travelers could be assaulted by bandits or barbarian tribes who were at war with other tribes. And just that he managed to do all of this, to cover all of this ground, and then not just once, but went back and did it again. We have to give credit to Troy and his cousin Morris Keene for actually spending time among the Bedouins. Richards, yes, he was the one who conceived the idea, and he made a few short trips to bargain with Bedouins. But it was Keene and Troy who actually spent several months among the Bedouin tribes. So to me, this reads like an epic adventure novel to me.
Excellent, excellent. What are you working on next?
Well, actually, I'm moving away in an entirely different direction. I've always been fascinated by horses, and as I said, my interest in Keene Richards and in researching and writing more about horses was when I learned about Richards' ownership of the Royal Spring of Georgetown. My primary research interest has always been in caves and karst landscapes. Kentucky is probably world famous for Mammoth Cave and the thousands of other caves that it contains. And there's a very important resource that can be found in dry caves in Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, and that is a naturally occurring mineral called saltpeter. It's a nitrate mineral, and it is the primary ingredient that was used to make gunpowder, black powder. And so when great deposits of saltpeter were discovered in Kentucky caves, like Mammoth Cave and the Great Saltpeter Cave in southern Kentucky, this was recognized as being very important to national defense. Lexington became the hub of a whole collection of gunpowder mills that were erected to take advantage of proximity to the source. And saltpeter from Kentucky was shipped to the eastern powder mills like DuPont, for example. DuPont got its start in business by making explosives back in 1804. So what I'm doing now is I have written many, many articles about gunpowder and saltpeter mining and so on. And I'm pulling a lot of this together to write a book that I'm calling tentatively right now, Blown to Atoms. Making Gunpowder in America, 1800 to 1900. And I'll be looking at the development of the industry in the country over that period of time, the 19th century, the technology that was being used. And of course, gunpowder manufacture is one of the most dangerous industries there is. Any little spark is liable to create a devastating explosion that would level buildings for, thousands of feet. That's one reason that gunpowder mill operations would house each step of the production in a different building. But I spent a lot of research. I've subscribed to several newspaper archives, and I've made a database that contains more than 1,000 gunpowder mill explosions that took place in that 100-year period. So a major thrust of this book is going to be looking at the safety measures that were taken by gunpowder manufacturers, the causes of explosions, the devastating effects of explosions, and so on. For example, workers were prohibited from carrying any smoking materials. They had to wear wooden shoes. All machinery was made of wood, no nails or anything else that might create a spark. So I think this is going to be a very fascinating project, and I have in mind, when completed, that I'm going to submit this to the LSU Press.
Well, we have a few other questions, Gary, but we've reached our time limit here at 3. So if you want to go ahead and wrap things up, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank all of you for basically tuning in today. I want to thank the LSU Press for hosting this event to showcase my new book. And I want to remind viewers that first, you can see my other work at my website, but if you're interested in obtaining a copy of my book, if you'll click on the little chat button at the bottom of your screen, you'll find that the press has provided a promotion code for you there that will allow you a 40% discount on purchasing a copy of the book from them. So anyway, again, it's been a great pleasure to be here and talk with you folks. And hopefully I may be back here in a few years talking about a different book.